I want to share some of some signs of hope that I think are badly needed in these times, and based on some research I did in Sudan back in January, just prior to the pandemic spreading. And I just want to start by observing that when the turbulent and often tragic history of the past decade in the Middle East and North Africa is written, the 2019 pro-democracy revolution in Sudan will probably be considered one of the bright spots. One of the world's most brutal dictatorships in power for over 30 years, one of the worst violators of human rights in the world, was overthrown in a massive nonviolent civil insurrection involving millions of Sudanese, and a liberal technocratic civilian administration has been put into place. And whether civilian democratic rule will survive the serious challenges still facing the country remains to be seen. But for now, I just wanted to focus on the question, how did they do it? How did the Sudanese people win, at least for now? Now, Sudan did not fit into what some Western analysts see as the conditions for a successful pro-democracy civil resistance movement. The regime was thought to be too oppressive, too entrenched, and too successful in their divide and rule tactics of the large and ethnically heterogeneous nation. The reactionary Islamist rule disempowered women. Civil society had been decimated under the 3 decades of military rule. The human rights situation was atrocious. The Sudanese people were seen as too impoverished, uneducated, and isolated. Millions of the country's brightest, most educated, most ambitious potential leaders had emigrated. Wealthy Gulf monarchies are helping to prop up the military regime, and most of the West had written off Sudan as a hopeless case. But despite this, starting in December of 2018, a movement emerged which eventually brought millions of Sudanese into the streets. By April 2019, General Omar al-Bashir was overthrown by fellow military officers. Protests continued, and despite hundreds of additional civilian deaths, by August, the military had stepped down in favor of a civilian-led transitional government. And what my research has shown is that there are a number of factors that I think those involved in other human rights struggles around the world can learn from. One thing that helped with Sudan was there was precedence. Long before the Arab Spring, the Eastern European revolutions, and other popular democratic uprisings caught the world's attention, the Sudanese had toppled dictatorships in 1964 and 1985 through massive civil resistance campaigns. Another advantage was that some of the main elements of the repressive apparatus of the regime, the police, intelligence, military, special forces, were divided, and the opposition did a great job at exacerbating those divisions and using them to the movement's advantage. Another advantage was that the African Union and the Europeans were on the movement's side, thanks in part to the efforts by the exile community and others to mobilize their support. An additional factor was that business people, even those who had supported the ruling party, realized that for the sake of the economy and therefore their own self-interest, they had to end their support for military rule and support democratic governance. The Sudanese regime was also incompetent. I mean, the economy was in shambles. Education, transport, healthcare, agriculture, other basic infrastructure had deteriorated significantly during their 3 decades in power. They had lost the southern third of their country, along with most of the oil reserves, and South Sudan became independent in 2011. And the international sanctions added to the chronic corruption and mismanagement and weakened the economy of this already impoverished nation. But despite its brutality, the state was in many ways weak. Young Sudanese had had enough. They felt they had no future, had nothing to lose, despite all the human rights abuses, and they resisted. And indeed, what happened on the ground was important. The most important factor. I mean, the critical factor was the scope and scale of the movement. I mean, unlike some other civil insurrections, which are almost exclusively in the capital with largely middle-class support, the Sudanese revolution took place all over the country in all different regions with diverse class and ethnic participation, Christians and Muslims, Arabs and non-Arabs. Professional associations played a key leadership role, but popular resistance committees were also active in even the poorest neighborhoods. Indeed, the ability to build such a broad coalition of forces was vitally important given the size and complexity of Sudan. I mean, for decades, the regime had tried to divide Sudanese by North and South, Arab and non-Arab, Muslim and non-Muslim. But the pro-democracy protesters recognized that national unity was critically important and consciously resisted their efforts at divide and rule. It was really impressive how they really brought it together. We are all Sudanese. We are not going to let us be divided, by religion or ethnicity or region or anything else. And related to this diversity was strong participation and leadership by women, which not only helped increase the numbers of protesters, provide a perspective that encouraged nonviolent discipline, democratic process, greater credibility, and better popular perception of the movement and its goals. I mean, under al-Bashir's rule, women had been severely repressed in terms of dress codes, employment, and even the ability to leave home without the accompaniment of a close male relative. But the women really made the difference in the struggle. Perhaps the single most important factor was nonviolent discipline, because remaining nonviolent despite enormous provocation made it difficult for the regime to depict the movement in a negative light. Nonviolence gained the movement sympathy it would have otherwise lost through violent tactics, and made it possible for people to feel more comfortable joining the protests, thereby increasing their numbers. The importance of maintaining this nonviolent discipline, not out of a moral commitment to nonviolence per se, but because of an understanding that tactically and strategically it was the best way they could win. If they'd use violence, the regime would have always had the advantage. By choosing what they saw, it basically was a different weapon systems, peaceful protests, sit-in strikes, and more. The regime was unable to depict the protesters as terrorists that would bring violence and chaos. And they did not trust the military. When they threw out Bashir, and unlike the Egyptians, they naively say, "Oh, you guys can work things out." They kept on pushing, kept on demanding that the civilians take charge, and they eventually won. And so it was an amazing accomplishment, despite the many obstacles still ahead. It demonstrates that whatever the structural obstacles may be, no matter how bad the human rights situation may be, good strategic thinking and tenacity by a popular opposition movement can ultimately win. This should be a lesson to those struggling for greater political freedoms, social justice, and human rights throughout the greater Middle East and beyond. Indeed, if an unarmed democratic civil insurrection can succeed in a country like Sudan, it can succeed almost anywhere, because human rights are worth the fight.